what I think is really the challenge for mining in Europe is for the past 40, 50 years, we have actually exported the environmental impact of mining. And we have imported raw materials because we have had a huge development, especially South America, Africa, Australia, which means that we don't really understand the implications of what happened for the past 50 years in that impact. What you actually talked about is an introduction of environmental, what is it, carbon border adjustment tax replaced with environmental border investment tax. So how to deal with that? Because that is actually what we have to deal with. We import materials which has a substantial bigger environmental impact than we can produce in Europe.
European mining, and mining in general, doesn't have a very good reputation right now. It's sometimes perceived as a dirty business that creates a very little value added for local communities and then leaves when the mining deposit is exhausted. And this creates what we call a NIMBYism, a NIMBY behavior, not in my backyard. And what my boss, Executive Vice President, always says is that we need to move from NIMBY to PIMBY, please in my backyard. So we have a collective responsibility, us meaning policymakers, but also the industry, to show to increasingly sensitive consumers that European mining and also that CRM-intensive industry can be respectful of environmental standards, of human rights, can create local value added for the communities.
The investment cycles are not in the political time frame of 1 to 2 years, but more in 5 to 10 and more.
Exactly, not for the administrative process, because there I think we really have to speed up, and the report of the Parliament is emphasizing this, so we shortened delays. We have tried to make the procedure easier, to reduce the data, that you use the data you already have, and we do not invent new parameters to be reported, that we have tacit approval, for example, which is not known in all the member states, but I hope that this will really help to ensure also that the process has a really defined delay time and not something we write on paper and afterwards the 24 months is 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, or whatever.
I would say it's perhaps a question about the chicken and the egg. There are a market today, as we hear. We start to realize that the green transition starts in the mine. We start to understand the proportions. It's enormous volumes of oil, coal, and gas that has been replaced with electricity. And it's enormous volumes of electricity we need. Produce it, distribute it, store it, use it, produce hydrogen as a reduction agent or energy, which means that the demand for these materials will be enormous. And from my point of view, it's hard to say that we really understand the proportions. But what I think is important to say and understand is that Europe has a unique position, especially European mining. We have a strong value chain. We have global leading companies developing unique mining equipment. We have mining companies that develop mining methods, processes. I would say that the problem is really to meet this market is how to get the process that we have public acceptance, which lead that we could have regulatory understanding what's necessary to do to really pursue the necessity of increase European mining, because it will be a question on global level.
Each mine is very different, so you need to identify the pain points and see where you can make the changes that will improve this footprint of the mine. As for the existing mines, because a mine has a lifespan that is very long, and then there is the new mines coming online. And what we hope to see is, for example, with reduced permitting, which is an excellent news, making sure that the permitting is conditional on using those best available solutions that are there.
Thank you for the invitation to this panel, which is actually very timely. And you are right, actually, this is a very complex topic, especially on the automotive sector. When you're talking to the OEMs, I would just like us to understand that raw materials from an OEM, if we're talking a battery, we're talking about rank 7, 8 in the supply chain. We're not talking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We're talking about long. But at the same time, we have to secure the raw materials. We have to secure the raw materials, but we don't know which will be the chemistries of the batteries in 3 years. So we have to sign long-term agreements with suppliers which are in a supply chain quite far away and for which we do not have really a direct relationship on the producing. For chemistries, we maybe would be changing in 2-3 years, or that volumes would not be materializing. So I would like us to understand that the automotive sector and the OEMs have to find their place in a triangle, which is a trilemma between security of supply, so securing the raw materials, the affordability, because we have seen actually the prices of the raw materials, how they can be volatile.
So for instance, as regards the heightened global competition, it incentivizes downstream sector, for instance, the automobile as a big consumer of critical raw materials, to take more responsibility for their supply chains. This means, for instance, that at least in the Commission proposal, there is this requirement that they check every 2 years, do a little bit of a stress test and an audit of their supply chain all the way up. So I think this is actually quite important to understand where strategic raw materials in particular are sourced, whether they are recycled and where. As regards speed and financing, of course, the key concept is this concept of strategic projects in Europe and beyond. This is the core of the Critical Raw Materials Act. This label, this definition is not just a label because it comes with advantages, indeed faster permitting, but also some help for access to finance.
I think this is really important point to see that we need also incentives, that we have really a stable framework, quick and easy procedures for crowding in of private investment. Because one thing is clear, you will never do that with public money. You really need the private investors, and for the private investors, it has to be sure how it goes forward, that it comes up also with the chance of having afterwards being paid off for that, and at the end, of course, also that the political wind will not change every 4 or 5 years, so that there is an acceptance in politics, but also on the ground with the societies.
I'm going to bring up now what could, I think, easily be described as the very large elephant in this medium-sized room, which is financing. You touched upon it, and it's been touched upon before, and it will be again. But let me make what's not, I don't think, a bold statement. The Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, they do have big ambitions. And I can sense that ambition both in your words and in yours. And I think we all recognise and we value that ambition. But if I hold up the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I look at its funding envelope, it's huge. I look at China with its state subsidy, it's enormous. So we have the ambition, but as it currently stands, accepting that the Critical Raw Materials Act is not the funding vehicle on its own. The elephant in the room for me is funding. It's about having the money that helps drive the innovation and make the necessary steps. So my question is a clear one on this before we bring in the rest of the panel. How, in your opinion, and I appreciate a short answer on this, how can Europe solve this elephant in the room? And by when? Because you mentioned speed as well. So I'll let you take that first.
Yeah, for me, it's not an elephant in the room because, yes, the US has the IRA, but we have the Next Generation EU. It was earlier and it's bigger. Often we only have in Europe the problem that we make things very complicated because in the US, this is tax reduction. So every entrepreneur knows if I go in that direction, though, this will make my costs less in such and such amount. And we have a pile of formulas to fill in, and afterwards maybe it's granted or it's not. So I think we should also clear up such processes and go more for such incentives. In the draft of the parliament, there is a call for a revolving raw material fund, under the umbrella of the European Investment Bank. So a special fund, which, and this would be then a discussion within the member states for the mission of the bank, going with a more kind of risk capital, venture capital, but clearly having a revolving form so that money comes also in if something is successful. I think this is then an instrument for de-risking, but at the same time having also a part if a model is successful. Something we do not use for the moment on the European level, but I would every time warn again, having now a race of subsidies and financing this only via public funds.
The Critical Raw Materials Act is not mainly about financing, we said that, but there are many other instruments that are related to financing. So the Critical Materials Act is one of the parts of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, and one of its pillars is financing indeed. And the Vice President Baer has already mentioned some examples of EU money that is available to help in this process. Repower EU chapters are an example, Just Transition Fund, InvestEU, NDC, Investment Fund, Horizon Europe, STEP, the new strategic...
Will you allow me an observation? It does,
many acronyms.
It does strike me when you list them all, while at the same time we talk about administrative decomplication. It does strike me as being rather complicated.
I agree with you. In fact, my point was indeed this, that the money is available, but I might agree with you that it's sometimes complex, especially for a company, to understand to which call exists, which call they can apply to, where they are eligible, which money they can get. It's very difficult for us that we work in the institution. I imagine it might be extremely difficult for people working outside. This I agree with you. And actually, this is also the spirit behind one of the first steps in this direction. The step creates this new sovereignty platform that should create a sort of one-stop shop for financing of strategic technologies. I think that some direction of travel has been given through the Strategic Foresight Report. I can mention it because it was adopted by college and Executive Vice President was in the lead. Here we mentioned that we need to move towards a Europe of investment. So of course we need private investment to achieve our open strategic autonomy and to put at its core people's well-being and sustainability. This is very clear. One example of these new concrete ideas is actually what Vice President Baer mentioned. We need possibly a new mandate for the EIB so that it can do more of the heavy lifting as the biggest public bank in the world to finance this new strategic net zero technologies manufacturing. So this is written in there and adopted by college. But I think that at the same time, we also need to rethink about the role of the public sector. So we need both of them. We need to understand how the public sector can, of course, help and support this flow of private investment, the risk when needed, help us move from the lab to the market indeed. And there is a little hint in the Strategic Foresight Report, and it's 10 areas for action to work towards a permanent fiscal capacity, for instance, in the EU.
I know
2 years ago, it wouldn't have been imaginable to have a Critical Raw Materials Act, and now we have one in potentially less than a year agreed. So the political mood has changed. The investors' mood has not changed, right? And so I'd like to come back to what Julia was highlighting from T&E here about the need for financing and funding. Decades of disinvestment in Europe, of disenchantment in Europe, only continent in the world where mining has decreased. You can't overturn that over a few months. And that also requires that you put more resources behind it at an unprecedented pace if you want to meet the demand in a sustainable way. So we're talking here and we see that the understanding of the challenges are well understood, but actually in Europe you need to do more compared to the others, and the others are at the moment doing more than we do. If you look at the US, if you look at Canada. And we need to enable financing in Europe for European projects, and we know, I was talking to a few colleagues earlier about the amount of projects that are in the pipeline in terms of pre-feasibility and feasibility, more than 100 on the European continent. How many will actually materialize? That's the key question. That's what we want to see happen in the next years.
Okay, so
the idea behind the initiative we took was to accelerate and to catalyze the interest of the financing community on mining. So we decided to put some public money, but it's investment, it's not subsidies. And we see that the investing community is interested by that. So that's the first point, is that we have some players in the European finance industry that are now interested. Of course, there is a very huge priority on sustainability, because all the finance community wants to be sure that this investment will be completely safe on this subject. But we see a huge interest, and I'm sure that if the EIB or other member states do the same thing as we are trying to do, there will be other initiatives to develop private financing in the mining and metal sector.
Hi, Vincenzo Conforti with Glencore. Two sort of dimensions of the problem. One is internal. I don't think we have a problem with capex in investments, especially when you look at processing. We have a problem with opex. We cannot maintain our processing and refining facilities open in Europe. It's energy prices, it's regulatory uncertainty, it's various bits and bobs of permitting. This, for me, is the core of the topic, not much capex. External dimension. What is the role, what is the value proposition Europe can bring in countries such as the DRC, Latin America, Bolivia, for instance, or Argentina, countries that are not sort of OECD like Canada or Australia? Is Global Gateway our solution, or anything else that you can think of?
Clearly, a specific question on a category of metals that are effectively small in quantity. It's not a huge sum. It's a very small part of the end products. But the market conditions are not adapted today to long-term partnerships. So on this subject, I think it's a very, very important subject, because if you lack, even if it's a very small thing, very little proportion, but you cannot build your panel, you cannot, and that's the same problem for germanium and gallium. It's exactly the same problem. So what we have to do first, the public side has to help, and we are doing that in France, and the European has to do, and we can help, and it has to do, in some cases, it has to be subsidies.
It's very clear that the transformation we have in mind for Europe's automotive sector and for the critical raw material sector towards 2030 are connected. Mm-hmm. It's very clear that the transport sector will have to do a big heavy lifting in help us achieve our climate neutrality targets by 2050. There are some very impressive figures. Transport sector needs to reduce CO2 emissions by 90% by 2050 for us to be able to do that. And this means that our EU automotive industry needs to show its strength and adapt to the age, to the era of electric mobility. This means a focus on batteries and electric motors that are driving now the value of automobile in industry. And in this context, of course, we need critical raw materials. First one is the resilience of the supply chains. I mean, this we have discussed already. There is, of course, an open dialogue on this aspect. But of course, it's clear that large suppliers of critical raw materials will have to check where they source the raw materials. And I'm not talking just about their direct suppliers of components, but all the way up the value chain, simply because the supply chain, simply because we know that, for instance, European automotive OEMs have very diversified component suppliers, but if you look all the way up at raw materials, sometimes there is big concentration. And this is a problem for the resilience of supply chains, because it exposes, well, us all, I would say, to potential disruptions in case of intentional or unintentional trade restrictions. And second aspect was also mentioned by Vice President, and I'd like to echo it, it's innovation. When we talk about competitive sustainability, we need innovation. We need innovation to be at the bleeding edge of this global, fierce competition. We also need innovation because in the future, in order to be sustainably competitive, we will need also more and more cooperation, probably with the digital tech sector. And this means that we will have our industry will have to adapt to ever faster innovation cycles. Innovation is getting faster. The future has become actually much quicker. So this is certainly an important point, where cooperation between car manufacturers, battery producers, raw materials producers and recyclers will be extremely important. So better techniques for substitution of raw materials, for extraction, cleaner extraction, and more recyclability. So two clear cases of cooperation where we have to do more.
Just to make it clear. In the report of the Parliament, the stockpiling is deleted. Because I think it's your responsibility. If you need stocks, you stock it, please, but it's you buy it. It's not the state who will make you an obligation to stockpile, and afterwards you come and say, okay, but then you please pay it, because then the prices are going up because of the demand we had because of the stockpiling. Just this will be a point we will have with the Council or the Commission. I do not know if you really put weight in that.
On stockpiling, first of all, it depends on which sector you are talking about. For example, for defense industry, I totally disagree with what you said. We cannot let...
We are speaking about automotive.
Yes, but it depends. The CRM Act is not the only. It's not the only sector which is. But so we have to find a way. It's everything is like that. It's a kind of also of public-private partnership. You cannot say just okay. The public sector will manage, and you know they have to organize also. They have to it's not so easy to build stock on the private sector. So in our view, it's not a question of what exactly the CRM Act would say, but in a practical term, we'll have to work public and private sector together to find a good solution, because today there is a huge problem. The European industry has not sufficient stock. It's clear.
It's not stockpiling what we need, but that we would need to mutualize the likely commitments that we will have in the future, which actually is maybe a hint on what could be developed as a kind of solution that avoids stockpiling. So
this new geopolitical environment, so absolutely it's something we have to take into account and an important challenge, but it also links to your point about lack of energy security. I think the only important issue you have to keep in mind is that we cannot avoid replacing our dependency on fossil fuels on Russia with dependency for critical raw materials on China. So this is very clear. I think we all agree on this. And certainly the two topics go hand in hand. So somehow we are trying to ensure our energy security, and this goes hand in hand also. We're trying to boosting our domestic mining, processing, and refining capacities in Europe. And by the way, some examples that we have developed in the context of energy to ensure energy security could theoretically be used also in the field of critical raw materials. For instance, the joint procurement of gas. We have created a platform for joint purchase of gas, which could be an example in the future also for critical raw materials. And it's also mentioned in the Critical Raw Material Act in a more open way, but we have certainly some lessons that we can mutuate from one sector to the other. And I think for many years we had this issue of a battle of narratives, and that we had to boost our European narrative on the global stage. This is very clear. I think it's still true, but it has now more and more become a battle of offers. And I think what Vice President Baer mentioned is very important. We have our global gateway, and there is the Belt and Road Initiative by China. So who is putting more on the table? Yeah, not only in terms of what you offer in terms of money, but also what kind of model you offer. So this actually has become a matter of models. We have to show that we can offer a different model, a different perspective. We have to take into account the perspective of third countries. And there is also the big elephant in the room, that do you want a liberal democracy model or a not so liberal democracy model, a different model? We don't know whom to refer to, so we need also to help and support this access to finance. And as regards public acceptance, the key word is not mining, but is sustainable mining. And here there is an important provision. Vice President knows it very well, the environmental footprint provision. Here the Commission is empowered in its proposal to adopt delegated acts in order to define criteria to assess the environmental footprints of critical raw materials, and gradually, with an impact assessment, to possibly introduce a requirement to declare this environmental footprint if it thinks that this will lead to supply of critical raw materials that have better environmental standards.
So you have to secure over long-term periods, but also on the ESG. We call for it because we think it's very important that the ESG criteria are really implemented in a coordinated, harmonized, standardized way, also because it's also better for us to be able to really understand what is happening on our supply chain. So really, it is a trilemma which is extremely difficult now to really calibrate properly. Mm-hmm. The long-term, mid-term, compared to the short-term operational targets, calendars, financial obligations, reporting results that an OEM publicly listed as we has to respect. Mm-hmm. So it's really an issue which should not be underestimated. It's critical, as the name says, for our product, but at the same time, it's very far away from us. So it's very important that we can build over the supply chain an ecosystem, and an ecosystem which allows this integration, not only of the ESG criteria, but also of securing the supply, and that is really responsible in this regard.
On the trade subject, maybe one important thing is level playing field on environmental matters, because it's clear that we all agree that we have to promote sustainable mining, but it's a problem if we import materials and minerals that do not respect this sustainable mining.
What I think is really the challenge for mining in Europe is for the past 40, 50 years, we have actually exported the environmental impact of mining. And we have imported raw materials because we have had a huge development, especially South America, Africa, Australia, which means that we don't really understand the implications of what happened for the past 50 years in that impact. What you actually talked about is an introduction of environmental, what is it, carbon border adjustment tax replaced with environmental border investment tax. So how to deal with that? Because that is actually what we have to deal with. We import materials which has a substantial bigger environmental impact than we can produce in Europe.
Level playing field, I think, is very important while keeping our commitment to openness and free trade. So this is very important. I agree that we have to consider that we're not operating in a vacuum, and we have to be more and more aware of the impact of our own policies on third countries. So what we're doing in third countries, so we cannot just have carbon leakage, as we call it. So I think this is a very important aspect, and you mentioned some policies that are trying to somehow solve this issue. But of course, when we talk about CBAM and other policies, I've already mentioned that there are some provisions that are those of market access that are also a sign of our coherence or consistency, if you want to say. That we want the supply of critical raw materials that have the best environmental footprint, and this is crucial and in line with our strategy. And I think it was mentioned already, the battery passport. This is all in line with this concept of competitive sustainability.
No, actually, I think there are a lot of different elements in the present discussion, that it went from tariffs to actually sustainability, diversification. Just I wanted to say that maybe it would be also interesting to put a focus on what the groups are doing actually to ensure that there is a little bit more traceability on the supply chain, that there is a little bit more diversification. However, here I put a caveat, because for some, it's not the same speaking about steel, aluminium, copper, or speaking about very precise rare earths or critical materials, which actually you can find probably in one or two places in the world for the moment. Maybe we can, but I mean, diversification at a certain point is not that easy either for some of them.
So for society, economy, and politics, it's accepting that we have to go down this pathway in common, and that we have to create and to concentrate. So it was totally correctly described that mining in Europe was not more possible anyhow, because people said, okay, we can import this from China, we do not look how it is mined there, how it's processed there, and everybody is happy. So, and this is over. It's not only over because we do not want this kind of also social and environmental impact, it's also over because of the geopolitical situation. And so I think we also have to prove as Europeans that we can do mining, that we can do processing, that we can do also recycling in a sustainable and also under cost perspectives.
I think there is not one bullet solution, so we have to align all kind of conditions. I think the quality of the partnership between the government and different kind of industry is the key. The possibility to exchange data, of course, it's sensitive matter, so it can be difficult, but we really have to create this environment of cooperation between actors. And for me, of course, you have all other things, you have financing, you have sustainability, but if we discuss, we cooperate, if we create the ecosystem, then I think we can be very optimistic.
I think we are trying to square a center, to square a circle, here, which is under a system which is based on free trade and competitive advantage. why an economic actor would like to put production in the place which does not have a competitive advantage in terms of costs. When we look at the IRA, actually, we look a lot into the subsidies. But the IRA is not only the subsidies. If you look at, it's a whole system. You ensure demand from local products, and this is where you are breaking the WTO rules, actually, but this is the thing that makes it work. And then you make the factors of production competitive. So you get not only CAPEX subsidy, but also OPEX subsidy. And you secure the supply chain via friendly FTAs. So this is how you actually square the circle. In China, you do it in another way. Just my boss usually says that China directs, USA incentivizes, and Europe regulates. Now, there is a full commitment from European industry, and in particular from Renault Group, to really get deeply involved into ESG and supply chains. We are producing all our EVs. There is a commitment to produce all our EVs in France. So I think we have been clear on that. Now we are ready to work as well with the supply chain as we are doing every day. But we also have to take into account the constraint to which actually an economic operator, such as a private and publicly quoted group as ours, is subject to. So more than happy to cooperate, continuing doing what we're doing both on the supply and on the circularity. That was not here the topic, but still very important in this debate, and very, very happy to have been to participate in this debate.
I would say from a mining perspective, or perhaps from a green transition perspective, it's all about the permitting process. If you have a stability from producing these metals, minerals, applications, and the process to get permit to produce electricity, distribute it, storage it, build products that can be used. It's all about get something different than we have today, but we have an administrative process that is endless in many cases. It has to be fast, it has to be swift, then you solve a lot of the problems.
I mean, I cannot disagree with what has been said, so I won't repeat that, but I'll just focus on the reputation and the acceptance. You won't reach speed if projects are not accepted. Sustainability is key for acceptance, and we can't solve that alone as an industry. So to the point of collaboration and partnership, this is required if you want a change of mood, not only at political level, but also on the ground.
And I think, first of all, thank you for this interesting panel. I think it shows that we are in front of one of the most momentous changes in EU policymaking, as I mentioned at the beginning. And it's true that for critical raw materials, the Commission, the EU, has a regulation, of course, but the regulation is not a strategy. And I can say that the Commission and the EU also has a strategy. And I think today we have touched upon some of the key aspects that beyond the regulation are actually part of the strategy to ensure a strong, stable, and sustainable supply of critical raw materials for our industry in Europe. And I think key words that come to my mind are, of course, strong intra-industry cooperation and solidarity, public-private partnership. So we need to work more between public sector and the industry also to understand better what the problems are, what can be done beyond merely regulating. So this is very clear, although regulation sometimes is important, for instance, for permitting. And what was mentioned about competitive advantage or absence of competitive advantage, sustainability indeed will be key, because we can create this competitive advantage in a different European way, which is this sustainable competitiveness. Thank you.
On the ground of the economy, I think it's good that Europe learns now that against the background on a very complex situation, that we really need coherent, holistic approaches. So it comes up from energy, you mentioned several times, the whole chain up to skilled workforce, so that this is really in the view also of the political framework and in the cooperation with society and with economy. But if I come back to the 3 points you just mentioned on directing, incentivizing, and regulating, for me it's clear that a good regulated framework can only be a small piece in the whole picture. And I would add that for me, the wish is that Europe is especially innovating, because I think that on the whole supply chain, we can see that innovation can be a game changer, and bringing back innovation, whether it is in the sort and the manner how we are mining, whether it is on the products we are substituting, whether it's better procedures for producing so that we can better recycle, easier recycle, or inventing new recycle forms from extractive waste up to the material we do not use anymore, and not exporting by black mass, but really recycling. I think this could be a game changer, and then Europe is a technology front runner and not only copying batteries or other things others produce already for less costs.